In the fall of 2024, the dry, cold air of the Wasatch Range blanketed Bear Lake Canyon, about a 2-hour drive from Provo, Utah. Investigator Mark Ellison's flashlight cut through the thick fog, glinting off the jagged rocks in a ravine that had been forgotten for nearly 2 decades. "Command Center, send forensics immediately. I think we just found something." His voice echoed through the canyon, mixing with the wind slicing across the rock faces and the sound of loose gravel tumbling into the abyss. What had started as a routine review of a cold case file had just turned into something entirely different. Something that might finally answer the question that had haunted Utah for. Beneath layers of dirt and rock, wedged between 2 massive boulders, the forensics team uncovered the crumpled steel frame of a Ford F-150 and 2 human bones lying atop one another, remains many believed had vanished forever in Bear Lake Canyon. The truck bore the plates of Silas Merritt Brighton, the man who disappeared with his adopted daughter Aurora in the fall of 2000. A disappearance that once shook Provo, leaving thousands of flyers, weeks of searches, and a community that never got answers. For nearly 2 decades, Aurora Brighton's name was a wound Utah chose to keep silent. The 20-year-old woman, last seen leaving home with her adoptive father, vanished along with the truck, without a trace. The 2005 search teams found only cliffs, dust and vague speculation. The investigation slowly went cold, the file closed with the note, "Location undetermined, cause undetermined." But then the discovery of the truck in a ravine nearly 60 feet deep changed everything. As the forensics team expanded the search area, they found scraps of fabric, metal scratches, and tiny pieces of evidence that once seemed meaningless, but for the first time revealed a truth far darker than the theory of an accident. What was pulled from the bottom of Bear Lake Canyon wasn't just the trace of a missing truck, it was the first domino in a chain of secrets buried for nearly 20 years. Secrets of obsession, control, and silence that stretched from Provo to Ogden. Because when investigators finally pieced together the bullet trajectory, DNA and travel route, central suspect wasn't a stranger on a mountain road. It was the man who had once lived in Aurora's home, who had once called her family Corin Malvern. The Aurora Brighton case is not just a reopened cold case. It is proof of the persistence of investigators, the power of modern forensics, and the truth that justice, no matter how long it takes, finds its way back to the light. This is a story of family, obsession, silence, and justice that is late, but never silent. Fall 2005. Provo, Utah was shrouded in a thin morning mist that clung to the Wasatch Mountains, making the morning seem more peaceful than it actually was. In the small Brighton family home, Aurora Lark Brighton was getting ready for a short trip up to Bear Lake with her adoptive father, Silas Merritt Brighton. She threw on her old denim jacket, grabbed a canvas backpack with a few familiar items, and stepped outside with her usual easygoing demeanor. Silas checked the pickup truck one last time, closed the tailgate, and locked the house before the two drove off. The normalcy of that moment made no one suspect it would be the last time they were ever seen. The trip was only supposed to be a day trip. Aurora had a habit of texting when she arrived, but the morning passed without a single message. Silas didn't call either, which was unlike him whenever he took Aurora far from home. The people they were supposed to meet at Bear Lake said the father and daughter never showed up. By noon, the family began to feel something was wrong with every unanswered call. They tried to reassure each other that spotty mountain cell service might be the reason, that maybe Aurora had left her phone in the truck, or Silas was too focused on driving to pick up. But as evening fell, the prolonged silence became impossible to ignore. The family made dozens more calls, reached out to acquaintances, desperately searching for any clue about Silas and Aurora's route, but no one knew what had happened. By the time they should have been home, their phones went straight to voicemail. Worry quickly turned to panic. Optimistic theories gave way to the sinking feeling that something completely wrong had happened on the road to Bear Lake. When darkness covered Provo and every attempt at contact failed, the family knew they could no longer wait. The tension peaked as they gathered the few details they had from the day and reported them to the authorities. Finally, they picked up the phone and called the police, reporting that Aurora Brighton and Silas Merritt Brighton were missing. He stood up from his desk, grabbed a notepad, and listened to the strained voice on the other end. A mother, a wife, a loved one trying to stay calm but unable to hide the panic. Every detail was written down. Aurora Lark Brighton, age 20. Silas Merritt Brighton, adoptive father, planned route to Bear Lake, time they left the house, and the fact that neither had been heard from for hours. As soon as the call ended, the officer immediately passed the information to patrol units, starting a nighttime search protocol. The first minutes are always critical. Police quickly contacted units near the Brighton home to verify basic information and see if anyone had seen Aurora or Silas leave that morning. Patrol teams were told to sweep the main roads out of Provo. Early data all pointed to the same conclusion: no conflict, no signs of trouble, and the trip was only supposed to last the day. This allowed police to focus on where they had gone rather than whether they had left home under stress or danger. By midnight, search teams began deploying along the most likely route to Bear Lake. Patrol cars drove the major roads leaving the city, headlights sweeping every edge of the pavement in the darkness. They looked for skid marks, dropped items, or any sign the truck had stopped unexpectedly, but everything was empty. As a well-traveled road that saw plenty of traffic during the day, it offered no clues. By dawn, the search shifted to neighborhoods and areas on the edge of town, based on the possibility the two had stopped or had an issue shortly after leaving home. They questioned residents nearby, but no one had heard screams, crashes, or anything out of the ordinary. Every witness said Aurora and Silas had left calmly, just like any other. After sweeping the main roads and finding nothing, police had no choice but to expand the search toward the mountains. Logan Canyon, a popular route to Bear Lake, was identified as the next focal point. Search teams moved into the area that same morning. The rugged terrain required coordination between foot teams, specialized vehicles, and rescue units experienced with mountain wilderness. Logan Canyon has always been a challenge in any search operation. Narrow mountain passes, blind curves, and deep drop-offs right next to the road. Foot teams assigned to walk the trails used binoculars and high-powered lights to scan every layer of rock and brush. Another group moved in off-road vehicles to check small turnouts or dirt roads the truck might have taken. But despite efforts that lasted until midday, they found no sign of Aurora or Silas. No vehicle debris, no fresh tire tracks, no torn-up earth or skid marks. Even the usual accident hotspots showed nothing unusual. It was as if Silas's truck had never come this way. At the end of the first full day of searching, police realized the scope of the case was larger than expected. With the main route yielding no clues, they had to widen the search to side roads, lower valleys, and remote forested areas few people visited. The search didn't just continue, it began spreading in every direction. Aurora and Silas might have gone. This was only the beginning of a long journey no one on the search teams had anticipated. Finding no clues at all during the initial sweeps forced rescue teams to push the search deeper into Logan Canyon, still considered the most likely route Aurora and Silas had taken. Patrol vehicles stopped at the canyon's entrance, while rescue teams fanned out across the treacherous terrain. From the roadway down to the trails leading to lower slopes, every direction was part of a detailed grid. Logan Canyon unfolded like a maze of rock and trees, with sheer cliffs just feet from the pavement. Police also examined the possibility that Silas had voluntarily left the state without telling anyone. This required reviewing financial activity, credit cards, debit cards, cash withdrawals, or transportation purchases. All data showed he made no transactions, suggesting he was preparing for anything longer than a day trip. His vehicle was not refueled at stations outside the route to Bear Lake, and there were no transactions farther away. In cases of someone intentionally disappearing, police look for signs like emotional decline, family conflict, or drastic behavioral changes. Silas fit none of those categories. He had no debts, no legal issues, and no history of serious disputes with anyone. The information about the period Aurora lived with her biological father led police to start questioning Corin Malvern Hale's role in the entire case. When his file was pulled for the investigation, the team's first step was to try contacting him directly. Every attempt, however, met total silence. The landline went unanswered, the cell phone was turned off, and the voicemail was empty. The prolonged silence forced investigators to visit his residence in person to confirm his presence. Corin's small house in Ogden sat quietly in a generally peaceful neighborhood. When police knocked, no sound came from inside. The windows were shut tight, The front yard showed no signs of activity, and the mailbox was stuffed with advertising flyers, indicating no one had been there for days. A few laps around the area yielded nothing useful. The team decided to speak directly with nearby residents for more information. Neighbors clearly remembered Corin's absence during the exact period that matched Aurora and Silas's disappearance. A middle-aged man living across the street said he hadn't seen Corin's car in its usual spot since the morning Aurora left the Brighton home. A woman next door remarked that the house had been quieter than usual, as if the owner had gone somewhere without any clear plan. The statements were separate, but together they formed one critical common point: Corin had not appeared at his residence on the day of the disappearance. While digging deeper into Corin's daily habits, police noted the picture of a fairly reclusive man who interacted little with neighbors and changed his routines in ways that made him hard to predict. Such behavior alone was not evidence of a crime, but placed alongside the fact that Aurora had lived with him and then left quietly, the combination demanded closer attention to Corin, especially since Aurora was described as open but always evasive when the subject of living at his house came up. People who knew Aurora said she rarely spoke about her biological father, and whenever she did, her facial expression often changed. There were no specific descriptions of arguments or clear conflict, but the unease in Aurora's reactions was enough for police to mark it in the file as a significant signal. This, combined with Corin disappearing at the same time as her and Silas, caused the investigation to shift direction noticeably. When investigators reviewed the full timeline again, one striking coincidence immediately stood out. Aurora and Silas left home that morning and could not be reached all day. At the same time, Corin also vanished from Ogden without telling anyone. It was hard to see this as mere coincidence. The concept of three people with direct connections disappearing at the same moment instantly raised the case's priority level. Police continued checking Corin's recent activities, financial transactions to public appearances, but every trail stopped abruptly at the exact time Aurora and Silas vanished. This not only made him someone who needed to be located but also the only person in the file who could be linked to both victims in a way that could not be ignored. The compiled information showed that Corin was not simply unexplainably absent, he had disappeared in a manner that made all traces of him stop at once. With Aurora and Silas, police still had no clear evidence of their final location. But with Corin, the fact that he left his residence and left no message whatsoever made him the most prominent name on the list of potential suspects. From this point on, the entire investigative team agreed that Corin's whereabouts could be the key to understanding what happened to Aurora and Silas. The disappearance of three people, no contact, no sightings, made police realize they were facing a case that was no longer a simple missing persons matter but might involve human factors far more serious than initially expected. Corin's disappearance at the exact same time as Aurora and Silas left the police with no choice but to act immediately, and the house in Ogden quickly became the next focal point in the investigation. When the team returned with a valid search warrant, the front door was still locked and showed no signs of forced entry. One of the first things they noted was the prolonged silence that enveloped the entire property. No engine sounds, no footsteps, no movement from inside. That stillness only reinforced the conclusion that Corin had left before anyone knew what was happening. Once inside, the investigators' initial impression was not one of chaos or disorder, but of an unfinished emptiness. Nothing had been vandalized, yet many places showed clear signs of being abandoned mid-task. A chair pulled away from the table at an odd angle, a cabinet door left ajar, a toolbox on the floor missing several items. These details did not suggest a break-in or a struggle. They looked like the scene of someone leaving in a hurry, deciding to go right then and there without tidying up or putting things back the way daily routine would normally demand. In the living room, investigators found several scratches on the hardwood floor, consistent with something heavy being dragged. Whatever it was had been moved quickly enough to leave marks but not enough to gouge the surface. A small bookshelf had been pushed away from the wall, and on its surface was a conspicuous empty space, as if something that used to sit there had been taken. No one knew what had been there, but the unusual gap was immediately documented. In the master bedroom, clothes were still hanging in the closet, but a portion of them were gone, enough to show Corin hadn't abandoned everything, yet not packed neatly as someone would for a planned long trip. On the nightstand were a few nearly empty water glasses, and an open notebook with nothing significant written in it. The desk drawer contained basic paperwork, invoices, mail, vehicle registration, all intact, nothing missing or rifled through. This puzzled the police even more. If Corin had planned to flee or leave prepared, taking identification documents would be the first thing anyone would do, but he took nothing. In the garage, Corin's personal vehicle was no longer there. However, there were no sudden braking marks, no tire skid marks, and no oil leaks on the floor. The garage was spotless, indicating the car had been driven away normally and deliberately. The forensics team checked the garbage can in the garage and found a few lightly crumpled notes, but they contained nothing related to travel plans or direction of departure, just ordinary daily reminders. In the kitchen, investigators noticed a few cooking items scattered on the counter and some food left out. These small details pointed to a sudden departure, not something prepared days in advance. A man living alone like Corin usually kept the house in a stable, orderly pattern, but this space clearly carried the feel of left mid-task. The most significant discovery came in the spare room next to the kitchen, where the team found valuable evidence. Several loose shell casings inside an old toolbox, drag marks on the floor as if from something heavy, and scratches on the legs of a metal table. The casings did not match any reported shootings in the area, making them especially noteworthy. Forensics collected everything for testing, as they could be the key to linking events to the disappearance of Aurora and Silas. Despite numerous unusual signs throughout the house, what stood out was the complete absence of any evidence that Corin had been a victim. No signs of forced entry, no violent disturbance, no blood drops or broken items suggesting an attack. This led police to conclude that Corin had left the house voluntarily, yet that very voluntariness heightened suspicion. An ordinary person does not simply vanish at the exact moment his daughter and her foster father go missing, unless his disappearance is directly connected to the case. Investigators tried to trace any trail from the house, tire tracks, neighborhood cameras, traffic reports, but every lead stopped dead at the doorstep. No one saw Corin leave, and no one remembered which direction his car went. The house hadn't been broken into, there were no notes about pet care, no messages left for neighbors. His departure from the house was identical to being erased from the neighborhood. No attention drawn, no traces, no clues left behind. The search ended with scattered pieces of evidence, but no definitive lead on Corin's direction. The house showed no chaos, yet contained enough disconnected details to confirm one thing. He had disappeared intentionally on the very day Aurora and Silas never came home. This pushed suspicion to an all-time high, placing Corin at the center of an investigation that was entering its most unpredictable phase. In the days following the search of Corin Hale's house, hope of finding a clear lead began to fade. The evidence collected inside was unusual, but provided no clue as to where Corin had gone or whether he was directly involved in Aurora's and Silas's disappearance. Police continued to retrace every possible movement, but every avenue quickly ended in emptiness. Not a single traffic camera frame, not one financial transaction, not a single witness who saw Corin leave Ogden that day. His disappearance left no trace, just like the house itself. No chaos, no confrontation, only complete absence. As for Aurora and Silas, every search effort in Logan Canyon and the side roads yielded no progress. The pickup truck, the largest and most identifiable object in the missing persons case, appeared never to have entered the mountain area. No tire skid marks, no broken glass, no braking marks, no signs of an accident. High-risk zones where vehicle falls typically leave obvious evidence had been checked multiple times. Yet the result remained the same, nothing connected to the two victims. The fact that no bodies were found made the case far more difficult. In mountain missing persons cases, bodies or physical evidence usually surface at some point, even if hidden by trees or fallen into deep crevices. There is almost always a chance of discovery through animal activity, microgeological signs, or natural shifting of earth and rock. Yet here the entire area showed nothing. Search and rescue teams experienced in reading tiny details, such as trampled grass or displaced pebbles, confirmed they saw nothing out of the ordinary. The total lack of witnesses pushed the case further into a dead end. The route to Bear Lake is heavily traveled, especially at the time Aurora and Silas were on it. Normally, if a vehicle stopped, turned onto a side road or had trouble, someone would have seen or heard something. Yet when police checked every store, gas station, rest stop and residence along the way, the answer was always the same: No one saw Aurora, Silas, or any truck matching the description. All three critical elements, bodies, vehicle, witnesses, were completely absent, creating a perfect information vacuum. In criminal investigations, this simultaneous absence is one of the hardest situations to handle, because there is not only a lack of data, but also no anchor point from which to reconstruct the timeline. There was no indication of where the trip went wrong, and nothing to suggest whether it was an accident or human intervention. The situation grew more tense as every effort to locate Corin also failed. He never showed up at work, never visited any medical facility, never contacted relatives or friends. Investigators checked outbound vehicle reports, airport passenger lists, car rental and hotel records. Nothing bore his name. Corin vanished the same way Aurora and Silas had. No trace, no contact with the outside world. As weeks of searching passed with zero progress, police were forced to place the case on inactive status. Detailed reports were sent up the chain, concluding that every route, location and lead had been exhausted with no results. Final internal meetings determined that without new information, the case could not continue using traditional methods. And then, in the heavy silence of a prolonged missing persons case, the files of Aurora Brighton, Silas Brighton and Corin Hale were labeled stalled, a temporary but weighty designation, signaling that the investigation had entered the dark territory no one wants to face. Being classified as stalled left the files of Aurora, Silas and Corin dormant in the Utah State Police archives for years, reopened only if new reports or statements appeared. Something that never happened. Yet time did not let the case fade entirely. During periodic reviews of long-term missing persons cases, the Brighton-Hale file was always flagged as special because the simultaneous disappearance of 3 adults with zero basic physical evidence to reconstruct their final movements remained one of northern Utah's most baffling mountain mysteries. When the periodic cold case reassessment program was launched, the file was officially transferred to Utah's cold case unit. The team tasked with decades-old frozen cases began re-examining every document from initial reports and search logs to photographs and field notes from Logan Canyon. They knew that to move forward they first had to break the case down into small pieces and re-evaluate everything with eyes unclouded by the urgency of the original rapid response phase. Evidence collected years earlier, the loose shell casings, floor scratches in Corin's house, moved furniture, was sent to the forensics lab. At the time, technology had not been advanced enough to read microscopic traces, but more than a decade of progress now offered new possibilities. The specialists categorized every item: potential DNA carriers, physical trace evidence, items related to movement, and objects tied to Corin's daily life. Each piece was relabeled, cleaned to current standards, and repackaged for the next round of testing. Parallel to evidence sorting was the review of original scene documentation, search maps, photos of every rescue team stop, and terrain reports for Logan Canyon were spread across the conference table. The cold case unit needed to determine whether any area had been overlooked or whether certain vantage points were inaccessible due to equipment limitations at the time. Many locations never surveyed from the air or deep crevices previously rated low risk were marked in red ink. This did not guarantee discovery, but it helped the team visualize the full picture and confirm no corner had been missed. A key question arose during the reassessment. Why was there no trace of the truck? The unit reanalyzed every old theory, from the vehicle plunging into a deep ravine or drifting into hard-to-reach water, to routes beyond Bear Lake. Each hypothesis was weighed against terrain logic and human behavior, but lack of physical proof kept them as reference points only, not solid investigative leads. Once all old reports were reviewed, the team prepared the next step, applying modern forensic technology, unavailable when the case first occurred. Microtrace particle testing, environmental DNA analysis, and enhanced imaging were added to the implementation list. The shell casings from Corin's house would be re-examined with the latest generation ballistic mark comparison systems. Fibers and scratches would be magnified and digitally processed to reveal details the naked eye could not see before. Even the smallest items once dismissed as insufficient information were brought to the lab, because anything, no matter how tiny, could become the crucial puzzle piece when placed correctly. With the testing plan approved, the cold case unit officially reopened the Brighton-Hale case in hopes of finding leads no one had seen for over a decade. Though the outcome was still unknown, The entire team understood that transferring the file to their unit marked a turning point. From this moment, the case was no longer frozen. It had entered a new phase where every old piece of evidence might finally become the answer they had waited years to find. The cold case unit's decision to re-examine all physical evidence marked a major turning point in the case, and as soon as the testing plan was approved, forensic specialists began feeding each item into the new analysis system. The technologies they employed, microtrace, fiber analysis, adhered dust, environmental DNA and microscopic samples, were all tools the 2005 investigation had no access to. Items previously classified as insufficient data now had the chance to be re-evaluated in greater detail than ever before. The microtrace team started with the spent shell casings recovered from Corin's house. Under high-resolution scanning equipment, their surfaces revealed fine striations that previous examiners had never documented. These marks not only identified the type of firearm Corin once owned, but also allowed comparison with ballistic data recovered from other cases in the Utah area during the same period. The real surprise, however, lay in the dust trapped inside the casings, something invisible to the naked eye. Microscopic analysis revealed the presence of a mineral dust characteristic of the Logan Canyon area, far to the north. This finding immediately caught the forensic team's attention, raising the question, how did Logan Canyon mineral dust end up in evidence from Corin's house? Meanwhile, the fiber analysis team examined the tiny fabric fragments collected from Corin's floor, fragments whose origin could not previously be determined. Multispectral lighting and polymer structure analysis allowed them to differentiate fibers by degree of wear and chemical composition. When the comparison results came back, several fibers matched samples from the jacket Aurora had been wearing around the time of her disappearance. It was not conclusive proof, but it was enough to establish that Aurora had been inside Corin's house much closer to the date she went missing than her family and friends had known. Dust samples taken from household items also yielded significant information. Environmental DNA, a new technique capable of detecting trace biological material from sloughed skin cells, proteins or other organic matter, revealed markers likely belonging to Aurora. Samples from the back doorknob and the edge of a wooden table produced consistent results, strengthening the suspicion that interaction between Aurora and Corin had continued right up to the time she vanished, not just in the distant past. This forced investigators to re-examine Aurora's entire timeline in the days leading up to the disappearance, because statements from friends and family might not have told the full story. Other microscopic samples, plant pollen, synthetic fiber fragments, and abraded metal traces, once dismissed as unimportant, when run through the new comparison systems, began forming a tight web of information. The plant pollen matched species found only on the high mountain slopes of Logan Canyon. The synthetic fibers matched the interior lining of Silas's missing pickup truck. The abraded metal traces matched the steel composition of the truck bed. When these details were pieced together, the analysis team realized they were looking at a critical indicator: the simultaneous presence of Aurora's clothing fibers, Logan Canyon dust, and materials linked to Silas's truck inside Corin's house could not be mere coincidence. Each tiny piece of evidence, each microscopic sample, each speck of dust, things that had seemed useless for years, was now forming a faint but highly promising chain of connections. It was not yet enough to reach a final conclusion, but it was enough for the cold case unit to recognize that this was no ordinary missing persons case. Something had happened involving Aurora, Silas, and Corin, and modern forensic technology was opening the first door to a truth buried for nearly 2 decades. The puzzle pieces had not yet formed a complete picture, but they were strong enough for the team to know they were closer than ever to their first real breakthrough. From that point on, the case took a new direction, launching the next phase of the investigation based on traces no one had previously been able to detect. The new forensic results from the evidence analysis turned the cold case unit's conference room atmosphere heavy with focus. The microscopic samples had, for the first time, created a chain linking Aurora, Silas, Logan Canyon, and Corin Hale's empty house. But to move from suspicion to high probability of criminal activity, the team needed a stronger piece, one capable of directly pointing to criminal conduct. At that moment, every eye turned to the ballistics. The ballistics team received the box of spent casings collected from Corin's house nearly 20 years earlier. At the time, analysis had been limited to caliber identification, The markings were too vague to tie to any specific firearm. Now, however, next-generation rifling comparison technology, using ultra-fine laser surface scanning, allowed experts to see microscopic characteristics neither the human eye nor older machines could capture. When the first casing was placed on the scanning platform, the rifling grooves appeared on screen in stunning detail, down to minor imperfections caused by loading or long-term wear. These images were then run through the comparison database to identify compatible firearm model. Initial results pointed to a common semi-automatic handgun from the early 2000s, a model Corrin was licensed to own, according to Utah state firearm records. To strengthen the finding, technicians examined additional casings recovered from the same spot in Corrin's garage. Notably, they had not all been fired at the same time. Surface oxidation showed they were of varying ages, yet the rifling patterns repeated consistently. This was clear evidence that the same firearm had ejected all of them over different occasions. When the internal database returned a high-confidence match and technicians compared it to Corrin's registered handgun record, the similarity was nearly identical. Although the casings could not prove Corrin's gun was used to cause Aurora and Silas to disappear, they represented a major leap. If Logan Canyon mineral dust and Aurora's clothing fibers were already present in Corrin's house, the fact that casings found there matched the type of gun he owned only reinforced the theory that Corrin was present in the chain of events leading to the disappearances. The ballistics team then conducted deeper analysis of microscopic imperfections at the base of the rifling grooves, random manufacturing flaws unique to each individual firearm, essentially the gun's fingerprint. When the 3D surface scans were processed through analytical software, the match was strong enough to conclude that the casings recovered from Corrin's house had been fired from the exact handgun he had registered, not just any gun in the same production batch. The next step was assessing whether Corrin had fired the gun around the time Aurora and Silas vanished. The condition revealed through casing oxidation levels and remaining propellant residue became significant. Residue layers were still present and not fully degraded, indicating the gun had been fired within weeks or months before the house was searched, aligning with the disappearance timeline. A core question arose: were the casings in the garage simply the result of routine target practice, or evidence of conduct directly related to the case? The cold case unit could not answer immediately, but the ballistic evidence was now sufficient to elevate suspicion against Corrin considerably. In serious violent crimes, a ballistic match between evidence and a suspect's registered weapon is always a powerful indicator. When all results were compiled, the official ballistics report confirmed a very high probability that Corrin's registered handgun was the source of the casings recovered from his property. This not only proved he had fired the weapon close to the time Aurora and Silas disappeared, but also provided clear grounds for the cold case unit to completely reevaluate Corrin's role in the case. From that moment, suspicion of Corrin was no longer based solely on his strange disappearance or indirect clues. Forensic science had created a specific technical and highly credible link, a critical step that moved Corrin from person of interest to suspect with high probability of direct involvement. The newly established ballistics results gave the cold case unit renewed determination to search areas originally deemed too dangerous or low probability during the initial investigation. Yet the true breakthrough came from a completely unplanned source. On an early summer morning, a group of amateur climbers exploring the remote cliffs deep inside Bear Lake Canyon, an area even more rugged than Logan Canyon, noticed sunlight glinting off something at the bottom of a narrow crevice. At first they assumed it was just scrap metal or trash blown down by the wind, but the steady flashing suggested a larger object below. When one climber looked through binoculars, he couldn't make out the shape clearly, but noticed the faded paint color resembled that of a pickup truck. Realizing the location was too dangerous to approach on their own, they hiked back to cell range and immediately called local search and rescue. When the report reached the cold case unit, investigators knew it could be a false alarm, but it could also be the first lead on Silas's truck in nearly 20 years. A specialized drone team was dispatched that same afternoon. As the drone descended and its camera swept the steep rock face, the image on the monitor made the entire team hold their breath. Nearly 60 feet down, wedged between two massive boulders and partially concealed by overgrown brush, a rusted silver metal hulk became visible. When the drone maneuvered for a better angle, the faded Ford logo appeared on the crushed front end. There was no longer any doubt it was Silas Brighton's Ford F-150, the single largest piece of evidence search teams had hunted for almost 2 decades. News of the discovery triggered an immediate surge of personnel to the scene. A rope access team trained for cliff recoveries was called in, equipped with anchors, carabiners, and rappelling gear to reach the vehicle. The operation proceeded slowly and cautiously. A single mistake could send the truck sliding deeper into the ravine or destroy evidence inside. When the rope team finally reached the vehicle, they reported severe cabin deformation, a completely shattered windshield, and doors fused to the frame. After prying open the passenger door, the scene inside confirmed what many investigators had long suspected but never had proof of. 2 heavily decomposed bodies remained in the cab. One body was in the driver's seat, the other in the passenger seat, matching the last known positions of Silas and Aurora on the day they vanished. Forensic specialists were summoned to the site immediately. They photographed everything, collected soil, plant, and glass samples, and documented mechanical evidence of the impact. The most striking findings appeared around the dashboard. Unusual cracking and bent metal suggested external force applied before the plunge, not solely a loss of control. Additionally, the truck bed showed deep dents in the steel that did not align with natural impact from simply rolling down the slope. In the bed, technicians recovered 2 critical items: a torn fabric fragment with polymer fibers matching those analyzed from Corin's house, and a small metal scrape on the frame, possibly caused by a tool used on the truck body before it went over the edge. All items were collected under strict chain of custody protocol, labeled and transported to the cold case unit lab. That day was recorded in the case file as the biggest breakthrough since the first month after the 3 people vanished. The truck, the largest and most important piece of evidence, had finally been located. The 2 bodies inside opened the door to determining cause and time of death, and possibly detecting signs of external force or violence before the vehicle went into the crevice. Most importantly, the truck's location was in an area the original search had never reached, proving the investigation may have been pointed in the wrong direction from the very beginning. The cold case unit understood that from this point forward, the entire trajectory of the investigation would shift. It was time to re-examine every theory in light of the new discovery, and prepare for a truth that could be far more complex than anything they had previously imagined. The recovery of the Ford F-150 and the 2 bodies inside it marked the start of the most critical phase of the investigation since the case had gone cold. As soon as the truck was transported to the Utah State Forensic Center, the examination team immediately began parallel autopsy procedures and mechanical analysis of the vehicle. Every step was carried out meticulously. This was the moment that could finally reveal what really held to Aurora and Silas in their final hours. Tissue samples taken from the 2 bodies produced DNA matches with the Brighton family records. There was no longer any doubt the person in the driver's seat was Silas Merritt Brighton, and the body in the passenger seat belonged to Aurora Lark Brighton. Although advanced decomposition made it nearly impossible to identify soft tissue injuries, Aurora's skull and shoulder bones showed distinctive fractures typically associated with high-impact force prior to the crash. Similar findings were recorded on Silas's skull, but the most striking evidence was not in the bones. It was on the fragments of glass and metal inside the cabin. While screening microscopic evidence inside the vehicle, several pieces of broken glass and dashboard plastic displayed round perforations with slightly flared edges, the characteristic shape of bullets passing through from the outside. Ballistic trajectory simulation software revealed that the shots originated from the left side of the vehicle at a low angle before the truck went over the edge. This confirmed the suspicion that the vehicle had not simply been involved in an accident, but had been fired upon before plunging into the ravine. On the exterior of the truck, mechanics documented a series of long scrapes across the paint and steel body running from rear to front, damage that only occurs when a vehicle is subjected to strong forward-pushing force, typically from being rammed or shoved along an edge. The truck's final resting position in the ravine aligned perfectly with a pushed-off scenario rather than lost control and fell. There were no brake marks on the vehicle body, further proving the driver had no chance to react or that the truck was no longer controllable when it left the cliff. Inside the cabin, another discovery drew particular attention from the forensic team. On the plastic surface beneath the steering wheel, investigators found fingerprints and epithelial cells belonging to Corin Malvern Hale. This was not fabric dust or vague trace evidence. It was viable human DNA with sufficient structure, clear enough for positive identification. The presence of Corin's DNA in a location only the driver would touch brought suspicion against him to near certainty. Additional analysis of the rear seat revealed several hairs matching environmental DNA previously recovered from his home. This indicated he had been inside the vehicle very shortly before the F-150 went over the edge. The truck bed also showed traces of a heavy object that had been placed there and then dragged off or pulled out before the plunge, evidenced by long metal gouges that matched the scratch patterns previously found on Corin's garage floor. These marks were not random. They bore the characteristics of deliberate movement, as if someone had pulled a heavy item from the bed or pushed the truck itself toward the drop. Every analytical result, the bullet holes, skid marks, mechanical damage, DNA inside the cabin, and the metal scratches, now pointed in the same direction. The disappearance of Aurora and Silas was not an accident or an unexpected mishap on the way to Bear Lake. It was deliberate, violent intervention. And in every piece of evidence the forensic team collected, the name Corin Malvern Hale appeared repeatedly as the inescapable center. The truck at the bottom of the ravine had become the turning point that shattered the fog surrounding the case for nearly 2 decades and shifted the investigation into a manhunt narrowed to a single name. The forensic results from the truck in the ravine allowed the cold case unit for the first time to connect previously scattered events into a coherent sequence. For years the case had existed only as disconnected theories, but now, with DNA, bullet damage, skid marks, and metal scratches as the foundation, investigators began reconstructing the entire journey of Aurora, Silas, and Corin on that fateful day. First, detectives combined data from Aurora and Silas's daily routines, including driving habits, familiar routes to Bear Lake, and common stops. Based on where the Ford F-150 was found in Bear Lake Canyon, the cold case unit determined the father and daughter had left the main highway earlier than expected. The truck did not follow Logan Canyon as initially assumed, but turned onto a lesser-used secondary route that led deeper into Bear Lake Canyon, a road rarely traveled yet still capable of reaching the lake area if the correct fork was taken. Terrain imagery and the skid marks showed the truck had entered a narrow gravel section where only a few spots were wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass. From this, investigators inferred that Aurora and Silas had not turned onto that route by chance. It was highly likely they were lured or forced to take this unusual path. Corin's entire timeline was also reconstructed using the new forensic data. His DNA inside the cabin, combined with Logan Canyon mineral dust found on shell casings at his home, proved he was on the same route the day of the incident. The presence of Aurora's fabric fibers in Corin's living space showed the two had met shortly before departing. Polymer fragments from Silas's truck bed, found in Corin's garage, opened another avenue. Corin may have accessed the F-150 before the trip, or on the morning itself. Using all these details, investigator reconstructed the sequence as follows. Corin followed Aurora and Silas as soon as they left Provo. He likely knew about the Bear Lake plan in advance, through observation, Aurora's routines, or direct contact she never told her family about. Detectives believe Corin tailed them on the main highway, then closed the distance once Aurora and Silas entered the low-traffic stretch. When the truck reached the Bear Lake Canyon area, Corin most likely used his own vehicle to block or force Silas's truck onto the side road. Heavy dents on the rear of the F-150 support the theory of mechanical impact before it went over the edge. Ballistic trajectory simulations showed shots fired into the truck from the left, consistent with the terrain where Corin could have concealed himself or gained a favorable position while following from behind. After the gunfire, a forceful impact from the rear caused the F-150 to slide over the edge. The long skid marks and scratches on the truck bed perfectly matched a scenario involving a strong push from behind, an intentional act to ensure the vehicle fell off the road and would be difficult to find. The truck's wedged position between 2 large boulders also explained why initial search teams never located it despite multiple sweeps of Logan Canyon. The timeline reconstruction did not end there. The cold case unit continued tracing Corin's probable movements after the truck went over. With no witnesses and no financial transactions, investigators relied on Corin's past habits and typical fugitive behavior. The data suggested he may have left Utah within hours of the incident. Escape routes toward Idaho, Wyoming or Colorado were all analyzed. However, the only remaining physical trace, Logan Canyon mineral dust in his home, supported the theory that Corin returned to his residence before fleeing the state permanently, possibly to pack items or erase evidence. When the full timeline was laid out on the board, detectives realized one thing: every piece now fit together in the only logical way possible. Aurora and Silas did not have an accident. They did not get lost. They were followed, forced to stop, shot at, and their truck was pushed into the ravine to cover the crime. Corin Hale, the man who vanished the same day and left his DNA on the steering wheel, had become the focal point of the entire chain of events. With a clear timeline for the first time in nearly 2 decades, the cold case unit was ready to move to the next phase, hunting a suspect who had been missing for over 10 years. Once the timeline was reconstructed and every final forensic piece pointed in the same direction, the cold case unit understood the next step was no longer in laboratories or terrain maps. It was finding a man who had erased himself from Utah records for nearly 2 decades. Corin Malvern Hale, with all evidence tying him directly to the day Aurora and Silas died, now became the official target of a federal manhunt. However, locating someone who had deliberately stayed off the grid for almost 20 years was never going to be simple. Corin's fingerprints and DNA were on file, but they had not appeared in any database after 2005, proof he had lived beneath society's radar with meticulous planning. The team therefore turned to another tool, facial aging AI technology, that reconstructs faces over time, significantly improved in recent years. Corin's last known photograph was fed into the system, and the software generated multiple versions based on natural aging, weight changes, and environmental factors. These images were compared against driver's license photos, ID cards, employee records, and commercial images in neighboring states. After nearly 2 weeks of processing, the system returned an unusually high match: a man working as a maintenance manager in Evanston, Wyoming, whose face matched 87% with the AI's Corin 20 years later rendering. The Wyoming employee was listed as Graham L. Norwood, age, but when the cold case unit dug into his background, every detail raised red flags. His birth certificate was registered late and did not match his original social security number. His employment history only went back about 10 years, with nothing before that. There were no medical records prior to 2000. Basic transactions. No long-term credit activity or major purchases. These patterns are classic for an identity built after going on the run. The Wyoming and Utah teams immediately began screening for fraudulent documents in the area. One of Graham Norwood's rental receipts led to a strange address: a cheap motel room on the outskirts of Evanston, where the previous tenant had paid cash for years, behavior consistent with avoiding banking systems. Investigators went one layer deeper: financial activity analysis. Although Corin left no major digital footprint, small transactions, groceries, store loyalty cards, and membership cards could be linked through user ID. When Graham Norwood's spending patterns were compared to Corin's pre-2005 financial behavior, the cold case unit found suspiciously identical habits, including purchases of the same repair tools, metal materials, and specialty cleaning chemicals Corin once used. Finally, when Graham's employment fingerprints were compared to Corin's archived prints in the Utah database, the match confirmed every suspicion: it was the same person. No more debate, no more The man who disappeared from Utah in 2005 had been living just across the Wyoming border for nearly 2 decades, under a carefully constructed new life. With positive identification and a confirmed residence, the cold case unit and Wyoming SWAT immediately planned the approach. After nearly 20 years, every investigation, every piece of evidence, every conclusion now converged on a single point: Corin Malvern Hale had finally been found, and the Brighton Hale case was closer than ever to the final confrontation between the suspect and the truth. The positive identification of Graham L. Norwood completely changed the atmosphere inside the cold case unit's command room. Years of chasing faint traces had suddenly narrowed to one specific address, one specific man, and a moment that could no longer be delayed. With an absolute fingerprint match and a clear residential record in Evanston, Wyoming, the investigative team knew it was time to shift from silent surveillance to action. The U.S. Marshals Service was brought in for the operation, working alongside the Utah Cold Case Unit and local law enforcement to plan the arrest of Corin Malvern Hale, the man who had evaded justice for nearly 2 decades. The joint team began with close surveillance of Corin's daily routine. Through traffic cameras and covert tailing, they established that he typically left his apartment at 6:30 a.m. to go to work and returned in the evening on an almost fixed schedule. However, the agents quickly noticed one critical detail: Corin still maintained an unusual habit of scanning his surroundings. Every time he stepped outside, he would look both ways down the alley and sometimes pause for a few seconds to check vehicle mirrors, behavior of someone who had lived far too long in fear of being discovered. The arrest had to guarantee 2 things: the safety of residents around the apartment complex and minimizing any chance of Corin fleeing. Especially since the suspect had used a firearm in the past, the likelihood that he was armed was considered very high. After 2 days of reconnaissance, the agents chose the moment when Corin had just left work and was heading back to his apartment, the time he was least alert, because he had grown so accustomed to the route that he treated it as safe routine. That afternoon, as Corin walked into the alley leading to the rental units, 2 unmarked U.S. Marshals vehicles slowly moved in from opposite directions. One agent, disguised as a delivery worker, stood near the entrance. 2 others waited in a vehicle across the street to block any escape route. The moment Corin turned his back or showed any sign of running, the second team would immediately move in. The instant Corin turned the key in his apartment door, the nearby agent quickly approached, raised his badge and ordered him to raise his hands. In that brief moment, a flicker of doubt crossed Corin's eyes, then shifted to extreme alertness. He froze for 1 second, just 1 second. It was enough for the remaining agents to move in and cuff him cleanly, without giving Corin time to reach for anything on his person or bolt inside. While being handcuffed, Corin asked only one question, cold and quiet enough that only the closest agent heard it. "How did you find me?" No one answered. Immediately after Corin was placed in the vehicle, a second team executed a pre-signed search warrant on the apartment. Inside, the small room was thick with the familiar silence of a life spent running. In a dresser drawer, agents found a semi-automatic handgun, the same type previously identified through ballistic rifling analysis. On a folding table against the wall was a stack of papers filled with disjointed handwriting, timelines and short, unconnected notes, some of which matched the exact dates Aurora and Silas left home. In an old topographic map of Logan Canyon, with faded red circles around certain locations, lay in the bottom drawer. The evidence was carefully collected, a firearm matching the previously identified ballistic characteristics, personal notes containing no explicit confession but with timelines and symbols related to the case, a map matching the side road where the vehicle was recovered, receipts for materials identical to those that created the scratches found in the Ogden garage. Every item was sealed on site and transported to the Utah lab for further analysis. By the time the operation concluded, criminal prosecution was virtually certain. The forensic evidence, ballistics, DNA in the vehicle, the location of the F-150, and the items in Corin's apartment far exceeded mere suspicion. They formed an unbreakable chain of proof. The U.S. Marshals transferred Corin to Utah custody under an extradition warrant, ending nearly 20 years on the run. As the agent closed the door of the transport vehicle, one sentence echoed through the temporary command post in Evanston, something everyone understood but no one had dared say aloud for years. "We finally got him." Immediately after extradition to Utah, Corin Malvern Hale was taken to the high-security interview room of the Cold Case Unit. No one knew how he would react: denial, total silence, or defiance. But Corin's demeanor when he entered the room was completely different from what many investigators expected. He sat down exhausted, quiet, and did not immediately request an attorney. The eyes that had once been sharp and cold in old identification photos were now flat, as if he had run out of strength to resist. The interrogation began with questions about his identity. Corin did not deny living as Graham L. Norwood, or changing his identity to avoid detection. But the crucial part came next. Investigators laid out the entire chain of forensic evidence: DNA inside the truck cab, the bullet trajectory from outside, skid marks on the steel frame, scratches matching tools from his Ogden garage, the circled map, handwritten timeline notes, and finally the perfect ballistic match with the gun seized in Wyoming. When the reconstructed timeline photo was placed on the table, a straight line from Provo Bear Lake Canyon, the shooting location, push marks, the ravine. Corin remained silent for several long minutes. Then suddenly he sighed and lowered his head onto the cold metal table. His first words were not a defense, but a simple statement. I followed them all the way from Provo. After that, everything poured out as if Corin had been holding it in for 2 decades. He described how the time Aurora lived with him in Ogden had caused him to develop a sick need to control his own daughter. When Aurora left and chose to return to Silas, he felt betrayed and became obsessed with the idea that his daughter belonged to him. The day Aurora and Silas headed to Bear Lake, Corin had followed from the beginning, waiting for the F-150 to turn onto the deserted side road so he could force them to stop. He admitted blocking the truck, trying to force Aurora out of the vehicle to talk, but Silas intervened. The confrontation escalated quickly, and Corin confessed to firing toward the truck in the chaos. The shot went through the left side window exactly as the forensic trajectory confirmed. When he saw the truck jerk to a stop and Silas lose control, he rushed to the rear and used all his strength to push the vehicle over the edge. Then he stood and watched for a few seconds until the truck disappeared into the dust-filled crevice below. Corin's confession was fully recorded and documented. Every detail he provided was cross-checked against the forensic evidence. The bullet trajectory from the left matched the position Corin said he was standing when he fired. The long skid marks behind the truck matched the pushing force he described. Corin's DNA in the cab was consistent with him approaching the vehicle before pushing it. The scratches in the Ogden garage matched the metal marks inside the F. The Bear Lake Canyon map had circles around the exact area where the truck was found. Not a single detail deviated from the investigators' reconstruction. Even the state of decomposition of the bodies confirmed the original date of death. After many hours of questioning, Corin formally signed a confession, admitting to the stalking, shooting, pushing the truck and fleeing Utah under a new identity. There was no sign of coercion, and the entire confession took place in the presence of appointed counsel. The legal file was completed quickly and included McLeod confession transcript, vehicle forensic conclusions, DNA forensic conclusions, ballistic comparison report, county prosecutor's office for trial preparation. After nearly 20 years shrouded in darkness, the case of Aurora Brighton and Silas Merritt Brighton finally had its answer, not from speculation or coincidence, but from the confession of the man who caused the tragedy. When the final legal conclusions were released and Corin Hale's guilty plea was confirmed in court, the news spread across Utah faster than any criminal case in recent years. Within 24 hours, state television channels, local newspapers, and social media were all focused on one shocking truth: a disappearance once considered hopeless had been solved after nearly 20 years. With every detail reconstructed, thanks to modern forensic technology and the tireless persistence of the cold case unit. The Provo community, where Aurora and Silas had lived, was especially shaken. Many people still clearly remembered early 2005 when missing person flyers covered utility poles, bulletin boards, and store windows throughout the neighborhood. The case had carried a shared memory of a baffling disappearance, leaving a lingering unease in the community for years. Learning that father and daughter were not victims of an accident, but of deliberate violence, left many people horrified. The sense of loss was reawakened, this time accompanied by anger and dread at the revelation that the killer was Aurora's own biological father. At the state level, Utah media asked the big question: why did the case remain in the dark for so long? Crime analysts explained that in 2005, forensic technology was limited. Aerial search tools were underdeveloped, and many mountain areas were simply inaccessible. Those factors turned the failure to locate the truck into an enormous obstacle that derailed the entire investigation from the start. Heated discussions began about the need to upgrade mountain search protocols and improve the storage and reanalysis of old evidence. As technology advances, Utah residents, especially those near Logan Canyon and Bear Lake Canyon, saw the case as a harsh reminder that the state's rugged terrain is not only beautiful, but can also hide the truth for years. Several community meetings were held, where people expressed grief and anger that Aurora and Silas had lain in a deep ravine for nearly 2 decades, unknown to anyone. Families with their own missing loved ones spoke out, demanding the state re-examine how searches are handled in difficult terrain. At the same time, the Cold Case Unit received widespread recognition. Long articles in major papers like the Salt Lake Tribune and Deseret News praised the team's persistence, from examining every tiny speck of dust, running weekly microtrace analyses, to using 3D ballistic modeling and facial aging AI to track Corin down. For many, this was clear proof that forensic technology is not just a modern tool, but the key to closing forgotten cases. On social media, Utah residents shared photos of Aurora and Silas as a way to remember them. Stories about their lives. Aurora loved hiking and painting, Silas was always careful and thoughtful, were retold to ensure they were more than just names in a cold case file. Some community groups even proposed placing a small memorial marker at Bear Lake Canyon, near where the F-50 was recovered, as a tribute to the 2 victims. Legal experts also weighed in, saying the case will become a textbook example of when old cases need re-examination with modern technology. A University of Utah law professor stated that the Brighton Hale case will be added to criminal investigation curricula as proof of the importance of preserving evidence carefully, because no one knows when a tiny fabric fiber or microscopic dust particle might become critical 10 or 20 years later. Even though the case is closed in court, its ripple effects continue to spread through society. Discussions have erupted about psychological support for victims' families in long-term cases, recognizing dangerous behavior in family relationships and the importance of reporting domestic violence early. Some local lawmakers have even begun reviewing regulations for missing person searches within the first 72 hours to prevent cases like Aurora and Silas from being missed at the most critical time. In the end, when the community looks back on the nearly 2-decade journey, the shared feeling is both relief that the truth was found and pain that it came too late. Aurora and Silas cannot come back, but their story has changed how Utah views missing persons cases, raised community awareness, and driven improvements in investigative work. The case is closed, but its impact remains etched deeply in the collective memory of an entire region. Based on the entire story just reconstructed, from the mysterious disappearance of Aurora and Silas, to Corin's nearly 20-year flight, and the relentless efforts of the Cold Case Unit, we can draw many truly valuable lessons for life in America today. This is not just a crime story, it is also a reminder of very real issues in society: personal safety, recognizing dangerous behavior within families, the importance of forensic technology, and the power of community in keeping long-term cases alive. In the story, Aurora lived with Corin for a short time and showed signs that were hard to talk about: reserved behavior, avoiding mention of him, unease when friends asked about the time with her biological father. In America today, many victims of domestic violence or psychological control display similar signs. The lesson here is that unusual changes in a young person's attitude or comfort level around family members should never be dismissed. When friends or relatives notice it, timely concern can prevent tragedy. The case also shows the importance of preserving evidence and upgrading forensic technology. Tiny fabric fibers, microscopic mineral dust, or bullet striations, once considered insufficient, became the keys to solving the case after nearly 2 decades. This reminds us to support investment in forensic science, protect funding for cold case units, and trust the scientific process. Even if results come late, they are never meaningless. Finally, the cold case unit's persistence reflects something American society has always valued. Justice has no expiration date. Even after 20 years, the truth was found. That reminds us that speaking up, demanding investigation, and pursuing justice for victims is never pointless, because sometimes all it takes is one small clue, one new technology, or one determined team to bring the truth back into the light. Thank you for following this entire nearly 2-decade case resolution journey. If the story made you think, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next cases reconstructed in this detail. See you in the next video, where we'll continue the journey of seeking truth and justice for stories once thought lost to oblivion.